I never thought I'd stand in front of a classroom again, not at 92 years old, with hands that shake when I hold a coffee cup and knees that creak like old floorboards. But there I was, looking at 23 pairs of young eyes staring back at me, waiting for me to speak. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had called me 3 weeks earlier. She said the children were learning about World War II, and she wondered if I might come share my story. I almost said no. I'd spent 79 years trying to forget those days, burying them deep where the nightmares couldn't reach. But something in her voice, a gentle insistence, made me pause. Maybe it was time. Maybe these children deserved to know what their freedom had cost. The classroom smelled like chalk dust and apple juice, so different from the mud and gunpowder that still haunted my dreams. I stood there in my old uniform, the one I'd kept in the back of my closet all these years, medals pinned to my chest that felt heavier than they ever had in 1944. A little girl in the front row, no more than 10, raised her hand before I even started. Her name tag said Emma. She asked me if I was scared during the war. I looked at her innocent face and felt my throat tighten. If you're watching this story and it touches your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that hype button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that every freedom we enjoy was paid for in blood and sacrifice. It helps us keep sharing these important stories. I told Emma the truth. I said yes. I was terrified every single day. I was 19 years old when I landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. Just a farm boy from Nebraska who'd never seen the ocean before, suddenly thrown into hell on earth. The water was red that morning. Not blue like in the pictures, but red. I watched my best friend Tommy Richardson fall beside me before we even reached the sand. He was going to be a teacher, just like Mrs. Henderson. He used to talk about it every night in our bunks, how he'd teach history and make sure kids understood the world. He never got that chance. My voice cracked when I said Tommy's name. I hadn't spoken it aloud in decades. A boy in the third row, wearing a baseball cap, took it off and held it against his chest. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were wet. I saw Mrs. Henderson wipe her cheek with the back of her hand. I continued because I had to, because Tommy and all the others deserved to have their stories told. I described the sound of the artillery, how it wasn't like fireworks or thunder, but something that lived in your bones, that made your teeth rattle and your heart forget how to beat properly. I told them about the cold, how we spent Christmas of 1944 in frozen foxholes during the Battle of the Bulge, sharing one thin blanket between 3 men, our breath forming ice crystals on our collars. I told them about the hunger, the fear, the way you learned to sleep with your eyes open because closing them meant you might never open them again. But I also told them about the brotherhood, how soldiers from different states, different backgrounds, different beliefs became closer than family. How we shared our last cigarettes, our final pieces of chocolate, our deepest fears in the darkness. How a man from Georgia taught me to play harmonica, and how that tiny instrument, no bigger than my palm, gave us something beautiful in a world of ugliness. I still have it. I brought it with me that day, pulled it from my pocket, and played a few notes. The sound filled the classroom, old and wheezing, just like me. But it was real. It was proof that beauty survives, even in the darkest times. A girl named Sophia asked me if I ever wanted to give up. I looked at her for a long moment, remembering a night in France when I sat in a destroyed church, surrounded by rubble, holding my rifle and wondering if I'd see another sunrise. I told her yes. I told her there were moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy, when I questioned why I was there, why any of us were there. But then I'd think about my little sister back home, about the letters my mother sent that smelled like her lavender perfume, about the America I'd left behind, the one where children could go to school without fear, where families could sleep safely in their beds. That's what kept me going. Not glory, not medals, not even patriotism in the way they show it in movies. It was love. Love for the people I'd never meet, the children who'd grow up in a world we were fighting to protect. I told them about the day the war ended, May 8th, 1945. We were in Germany, exhausted, hollow-eyed, barely recognizable as the young men who'd shipped out years before. When the news came, there was no celebration like you see in the photographs. We just sat there silent, too tired to cheer, too broken to feel relief. We thought about the ones who weren't there to see it, the empty spaces where our friends should have been. Victory didn't feel like winning, it felt like surviving. And survivor's guilt, I learned, is a wound that never fully heals. The classroom was completely silent now. Even the usual shuffling of feet and rustling of papers had stopped. These children, who'd grown up with video games and action movies that made war look exciting, were seeing the truth. War isn't adventure. It's loss. It's sacrifice. It's young men dying in mud, calling for their mothers, never getting to live the lives they dreamed about. I showed them a photograph I'd carried in my wallet for 79 years. It was creased and faded, the edges worn soft from decades of handling. It showed 5 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like we didn't have a care in the world. I pointed to each face and said their names. Tommy Richardson, killed on D-Day. James Chen, died in the Ardennes. Robert Martinez, lost in the liberation of a concentration camp. William O'Brien made it home but took his own life 2 years later because the war never left his head. And me, the only one still here to tell the story. That's when I saw it, tears streaming down faces. Not just the children, but Mrs. Henderson, the teaching assistant in the corner, even the principal who'd quietly slipped in to listen. A boy named Marcus stood up, walked to the front of the room and hugged me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His small arms around my old frame said everything. Then another child came, and another. Soon I was surrounded by these young souls, offering comfort to an old soldier who'd carried his burden alone for so long. I told them why I'd finally agreed to come, why I'd broken my silence after all these years. It's because I'm 92 years old, and soon there won't be any of us left. The men who stormed those beaches, who liberated those camps, who saw the true cost of freedom, were disappearing. Every day we lose more voices, and when we're gone, all that will remain are the history books and the stories we chose to share. I needed these children to understand that the freedoms they take for granted, the ability to go to school, to speak their minds, to live without fear, these things were purchased with blood. Real blood from real people who had real dreams that were cut short. I asked them to make me a promise. I asked them to remember, not just the dates and the battles, but the humanity. Remember that every name on every memorial was a person who laughed, who loved, who had a favorite song and a secret fear. Remember that war should always be the last option, never the first. Remember that the opposite of war isn't peace. It's understanding, compassion, the willingness to see the humanity in others, even when they look different or believe different things. Emma, the little girl who'd asked the first question, raised her hand again. She asked me if I was a hero. I shook my head. I told her the heroes were the ones who didn't come home. I was just a survivor, a witness, a man who'd been given the gift of a long life that so many others were denied. But if she wanted to honor heroes, she could do it by being kind, by standing up against injustice, by never taking her freedom for granted, and by teaching her own children someday about the price that was paid. As I prepared to leave, the children had made cards for me, hand-drawn pictures of American flags, thank-you notes in crayon and marker, promises to remember. One card showed a soldier holding a harmonica under a starry sky. Another said simply, "You are brave. Thank you for my freedom." I collected them carefully, knowing they'd join the photograph in my wallet, new memories to carry alongside the old ones. Mrs. Henderson walked me to my car. She thanked me for coming, for sharing what she knew must have been painful. I told her the truth. It was painful. Every word had reopened old wounds, but it was also healing. For 79 years, I'd carried those stories alone, locked in the dark corners of my mind where they festered and grew. Speaking them aloud, seeing them received with such respect and emotion, it was like finally setting down a weight I'd carried for too long. That night I sat in my living room, the cards spread out on the coffee table in front of me. My daughter called, as she does every evening, and I told her about my day. I told her about the children's faces, about the questions they asked, about the tears we all shed together. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my own eyes water. She said, "Dad, Tommy would be proud. You became the teacher he never got to be." I realized she was right. In that classroom, I'd done what Tommy had dreamed of doing. I'd taught history, not from a textbook, but from the heart. I'd made those children understand, not just with their minds, but with their souls. And in doing so, I'd given Tommy's dream a kind of life, a legacy that extended beyond his too short 19 years. The next week, Mrs. Henderson called again. The children wanted to know if I'd come back. They had more questions. They wanted to hear more stories. And something in me, something that had been dormant for decades, stirred to life. Maybe this was my purpose in these final years. Maybe this was why I'd survived when so many others hadn't. Not just to remember, but to teach, to make sure that the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice weren't forgotten in the comfortable peace that followed. I'm 92 years old. My hands still shake, my knees still creak, and the nightmares still come sometimes in the dark hours before dawn. But now I have a reason to face each new day. I have stories to tell, children to teach, memories to preserve. Tommy, James, Robert, William, all the boys who never got to grow old, they live on through my words. Their sacrifice means something, because I make sure it means something. So I said yes. I'll go back to that classroom. I'll stand in front of those young eyes, and I'll tell them the truth about war, about sacrifice, about the terrible price of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, they'll carry those lessons forward into a world that desperately needs to remember that peace is precious, that every human life has value, and that the greatest honor we can give to those who fell is to build a world worthy of their sacrifice. Would you have had the courage to share your pain if it meant teaching the next generation? Would you break your silence after 79 years? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to remember that behind every history lesson is a human story, a real person who lived and loved and lost. Thank you for listening to An Old Soldier's Tale. Thank you for remembering.